Hello and welcome to Truth and Liberty. This is your host, Mike Lewis. This is going to be, I think, episode 9. So, thanks for sticking with me here. We are back in Romans 13 to get today, and this has been a good study. So, I think we're going to wrap up the exegesis of the first 7 verses of Romans 13 today, and begin to start talking about probably the meat of the issue. And you'll understand what I mean when I get there. So we've begun to turn the corner, I guess. In the first few verses, we sort of laid the groundwork of our duty to government, and I guess I'm going to kind of review that here in a sense. It's been kind of a difficult passage to untangle in some ways. There's a lot that it doesn't actually say, and so we have to be very careful to keep ourselves within those boundaries. Today we're going to look at verses 6 and 7, and like I said, we're really going to get to the heart of this issue. Up to this point, basically, I've laid out the case for what could be called minarchism. Minarchism is basically a fancy word for limited government, but it's not your Tea Party Republican limited government, which is basically just it's just statism with heavy foreign policy, just low on the whole wealth redistribution, entitlement programs for domestic, for poor people type of stuff. No, that's not what we're talking about. Limited government, limited in the sense that they are limited to only doing what God has specifically authorized them to do, using their sword in the ways that God has authorized them to use their sword here in Romans 13. So that's the kind of liberty government we've been promoting here. And so we've also, taken a lot of time to talk about the Christian's duty to submit. And I did want to make some further comments about that before I press on. I've sort of belabored this point about how we need to submit to government. And really the reason why I did that is because I really wanted to counter the perception that my anarchism is somehow like sinfully revolutionary or something like that, right? I'm not advocating that, since we believe that the state is wrong in certain ways, we should overthrow it, right? No, absolutely not. That is not what is within the allowable bounds of what God commands here. In fact, God very clearly commands that we submit to government, and it's not dependent, as I said, on whether they are right or just or not, right? So I belabored the point mainly to make that clear, right? But I sort of neglected something because there is an exception, and I wanted to make mention of that. Really, I sort of briefly mentioned civil disobedience, and I sort of put it in a bad light. And it's mostly because I didn't really want to dig into it all that much, because it is a complicated subject. But I felt like I really need to mention it, because I kind of need to balance everything. What I mean by the exceptions is that in Reformed theology, the traditional interpretation of our duty to government is that there is an exception to our submission ethic. So take for instance Acts 4. In Acts 4, Peter and John are brought before the council. And they're commanded not to speak in Jesus' name. And in verse 19, they make the statement, they say, whether it is right in the sight of God to listen to you rather than to God, you must judge, for we cannot but speak of what we have heard. So Peter here basically says they've been put in this position where they have to choose whether they want to obey God or the human authorities. He says he chooses to obey God, saying that it's right in the sight of God. That's great. The Reformed interpretation here is great. It's rock solid. In this situation, the human authority, our duty to obey human authority ends when we are commanded to do something contrary to God's commands. The disciples were commanded to make disciples. God commanded them to, Jesus gave them that commission, go and make disciples. In order to do that, they have to speak in Jesus' name. They have to proclaim the gospel. The council comes in and says, don't do that. Now they're stuck. They have to choose, right? Peter had to choose to obey God, which means he had to disobey man. I don't disagree with that interpretation. I think it's perfectly valid. And, if the category that we're thinking in is, when do I have to obey government, then it's pretty much as far as we need to go on this, right? Obey government unless doing so would require you to sin, right? But there's another category, and that's really the groundwork that we've laid so far, and this is what I mean by turning the corner. we've really begun to turn the corner to understanding that there's actually another category to think about this. And this is where I was talking about by making the parallels to Ephesians 6. The second category is what is right for government to command. And again, I made the point before that the reason why we think about this is because as voters, as people who have influence in our government, we sort of have to think that way in order to answer how should we engage, what should we advocate for, what should we vote for, what should we request that our government do, right? And so we have to think about it in this category. So in this category, I take away an understanding here that Peter's refusal to submit to the governing authorities, well, an exception, there was actually a reason behind that exception, right? And the reason why there's that exception is not really that much of an exception. The council did not actually have legitimate authority to make that command. Their authority comes from God. They're his servants to carry out his wrath, right? The scope of their authority is therefore constrained, right, to what God has granted unto them, right? So the reason for the exception is it's not just this affective domain dissonance where Peter has to choose between two bad options and he chooses the lesser of two evils. No, it's because one option in this case was actually evil, disobeying God. The other option was, at worst, morally neutral, which would be ignoring an invalid command that the authority didn't have the authority to make. So, since the invalid human command was a command to commit the evil of disobeying God, then it actually became a positive moral good to disobey the invalid human command. So, when it comes to things like civil disobedience, there's this whole gray area, right? Where's the line on this? When is it right to disobey a command of human government? And the traditional position has always been, and I will side with this, that you err on the side of obedience. You err on the side of obedience unless there is a clear need to disobey human authority in order to not disobey God. But even in doing this, it's important to point out, and I make this point, I make this clarification because I think there's confusion about that, right? Why do we submit? Well, we are commanded to submit, right? And I think in Romans 13, again, I've made the point, our duty to submit is not dependent on whether they're just or not here. We are commanded to submit. But the nature of that submission is not that their authority therefore becomes valid because we're submitting to it. So let's consider the scenarios we might find ourselves in. With respect to this idea of submitting to government authority. So you have, on the one end, you have where the government is operating within the legitimate scope of authority that God has given them. They're using the sword for what God has commanded them to use the sword for, and that's all they're really doing. And they're basically commanding things that are just and following God's law, basically. In that situation, when you obey them, you are obeying both them and God at the same time, because not just because God says to obey them, but because you are obeying God, right? On the polar opposite end, you have the situation like Peter found himself in, where the magistrate was directly contramanding God, and what they were commanding was directly opposed to what God had commanded. And they were overstepping their bounds completely and giving a command in which put Peter in a situation where he had to make that choice. In that case, you have a duty to disobey the human authority because you have a duty to obey God. So in the first case, you have a duty to obey God and man. In the second case, you have a duty to disobey man because we always have a duty to obey God. And our duty to obey God supersedes everything. So in between those two extremes, then, you have a couple different other categories. You have a category where you have duties that God commands that civil government sort of leaves alone. And those things are things where we obey God because we obey God. Maybe there are situations where the civil government is unjustly trying to coerce and compel people to do those good things. We would still want to do those good things because God commands them, not because the magistrate is commanding them. We don't believe that the magistrate has the just authority to coerce people to do morally positive, good things. We believe that, again, as we've seen in Romans 13, they only have the duty and the responsibility and the authority to punish those who actively do evil things. But in this scenario, whether the government makes the command or not to require you to do these duties that God commands, or to refrain from doing evil things that God does not, that God commands we shouldn't do, then we would obey God regardless of what man says, right? But then you have two different really categories of when that I see of when the human authority makes a command that is outside the scope of God's authority that He's actually given them. And you could sort of group these together because of their similarity, and really they're subdivisions of the same group. And this is where that gray area comes in with civil disobedience. You have basically in both cases the civil government has made a law that is unjust because it violates their charter, it violates God's provision and God's command for what they're supposed to be doing, but it does not inherently require you to sin. So the question is, what do we do with that? And my answer is, this is where the gray area comes in. This is where a conscience is really necessary. And I think that Romans 13 and elsewhere in Scripture, Romans 12, would have us to have a general mindset of saying, we're going to submit to that. Even though, again, they're not just. This is not something that God has prohibited. It's not something God has required. Maybe God's silent on this. It's an issue where, let's say they make a law that you have to put certain things in the recycling bin instead of the trash can. I mean, those kinds of things, right? Stuff that God doesn't really say one way or another, but the government is making a law. Things like speeding, right? What is there inherently immoral about driving over a certain speed limit? Well, the government has said you shouldn't drive over that certain speed limit, right? So what do we do? I think the submission ethic would have us say, at least err on the side of saying, we're going to obey. We're going to obey those laws. A couple things to say about that. Number one, it is not the same kind of obedience. It's not the same kind of sin to disobey that as it would be to disobey a clear command of God that they are there to enforce, right? There's a different degree of that, right? Failing to obey that command from government is not the same classification of sin, I don't think, as doing like an outright evil thing, whether the government forbids it or not, whether the government, it falls within the scope of the government's authority. It's not the same kind of sin, right? It's more of a sin of failing to do our positive moral duty of living at peace with those around us, particularly our enemies, particularly those government authorities who are overstepping their bounds of their authority. But again, I see two little subdivisions in this category. There's the issues where they're more inconveniences to me, where I would rather not have to sort my recycling, right, in a certain way, or I would rather not have to drive below a certain speed limit. I would rather be allowed to drive whatever speed I feel I can drive safely at. That's one category. But then you have another category. And this other category is where you really get into that gray issue. It's where you have systemic type injustices, to where maybe it doesn't even affect me personally. But there's some sort of systemic injustice in society where people at large are treated unjustly. And as a result of that systemic injustice, as a result of people not standing up against that systemic injustice, millions of people are being treated unjustly and unkindly and unfairly by the government in some various ways. And in those situations, that's where the judgment call really comes in. That's where standing up and speaking out and refusing to comply with the system as it is, because you're speaking out on behalf of all of those other people who are being treated unjustly. To me, that's a different thing. I don't know where I would stand on that. I would very much counsel caution for anyone who would say, well, I need to stand up for these people. This is an exception because keeping silent is to imply approval, right? So there's a lot of gray area right here, right? There's a wisdom issue. There's concern for others, and it's really hard to take a dogmatic stance on any particular issue. But like Rosa Parks, was she violating our duty to submit to government when she refused to move to the back of the bus? Those kinds of things. What happened in the civil rights movement, what Gandhi did in India, all the other sorts of civil disobedience issues where peaceful ones, mind you, not violent ones, peaceful ones, where people weren't violating anybody's property rights, weren't harming anybody, but they were just standing up and saying, no, we're not going to allow this to be an injustice in our society. I still think that we need to be careful here because, again, self-justification can be a strong temptation here, and a desire to have our way, it can be a strong temptation here. And I would very much want to take very seriously whether or not we're rebelling and resisting government, right? And we have to weigh the cost of doing this, because resisting government in this way will bring about some sort of response, right? And so it's a matter that is a weighty one, and it's a very, very gray issue, and it's an issue where Christians need consciences that are trained by God's word, and they need wisdom, and they need to be able to think through these things. And so I just want to mention that and leave that open as a category to say, wherever you fall on this civil disobedience thing, on any particular issue, it's a tough subject, and so I don't want to brush it away. I don't want to treat it lightly, but I think the founding principle is we err on the side of obeying government unless there's a clear command that we'd violate God's law, in which case we have a duty to disobey them, and then in the gray areas, everything needs to be handled with prayer. And we need to pick our battles. It's important to remember that we're not here to overthrow this world system. We're here to be salt and light. And so that can involve being agents of change in this world system. But don't set your hope on that, right? And don't think that because you're not doing it, somehow you're not, you're falling down on your duty, right? And definitely, absolutely do not think that you somehow have justification to sin in the name of being that agent for change, even when the law is unjust, right? So there's this gray area there, right, for civil disobedience. And so I want to acknowledge that. I want to make sure that's clear. And it's a matter of conscience. It's one that you have to take very seriously. You have to think through. You have to be, and I would say, again, for the sake of safety, right, for the sake of conscience, be clear that what you're doing is actually an issue of God's law, if you're going to stand up and disobey, right? So again, be very wary. So anyway, keep all that in mind as we study Romans 13, because again, there's a lot of people who would say, our duty to submit, therefore the state is valid, and so that's all we have to think. And so that's an invalid way of thinking. I've sort of belabored that, but so we need to move on because I don't want to spend all my time there. So we've been thinking in two categories. Category one is, as a citizen, what is my duty to government? We've pretty much settled that. Be subject to, i.e., submit to them, live at peace with them, keep your head down, obey the law, do what is good, don't take vengeance on yourselves, live at peace with everybody, do what is honorable in the sight of all. Just sort of everything from Romans 12, like verse 16-ish, all the way down through Romans 13:7. Everything in there, right? So don't resist the government. Don't be a rebel. Don't be a revolutionary. Don't be violent. Don't make trouble. Just live at peace, right? All of that sort of fits together there. What is our duty? To be ordered under the government. We're not here to make trouble. We're not here to overthrow them. We're not here to rebel against them. We're not here to be revolutionaries. We're just here to be salt and light in the world, right? But then there's category two. Category two is, imagine that you are the one in authority. You are the king. You are writing the constitution for your new desert island nation. Or maybe probably more appropriately, you are voting for politicians and or local state ballot issues, right? You're writing your politician. One way or another, you are influencing the way your government operates. So, what does the government have authorization to do? What should you influence your government towards? That's a question that we've started to settle, right? In fact, we already laid the foundational work, right? The government uses the sword against wrongdoers and wrongdoers only. We clarified that, right? And I think I've laid that case out pretty clear. So far, though, we've not really taken a position on what form of government God prescribes because, well, honestly, he doesn't actually prescribe one particular form of government. A state can fulfill that role. A king, an emperor, a republic, a democracy, and any number of those forms of government can fulfill that form of government. And I insist there's another form of government that has been actually tried in history. People say, well, this has never been tried. Actually, it's existed, like in Ireland, in the Middle Ages, etc., in various forms. So it's been done before, but it's anarcho-capitalism, and there's variants on what that would look like. So the Rothbardian view has like this, governments are companies that anybody you live in a city and there might be 5 companies you could subscribe to one or you could subscribe to another one. That's kind of the Rothbardian view. The Hoppe view is a little more like almost like a really decentralized minarchy, where you would have these covenant communities where people in a local community would all agree to be under a certain authority, but then you could move away if you wanted to, or they could kick people out of the community if they needed to, and stuff like that. It's a little more nuanced, but basically the idea is that there's not one overarching state. And I insist that the anarcho-capitalist view actually can fulfill the same role. But I will admit that the scriptures doesn't directly, exegetically, take one position or another. So we can't really take a dogmatic position here. Why do I advocate for my position then? Well, because I believe that it's correct by logical consequence. I really prefer, even though I'll say, in a broad camp of liberty sense, it obviously would include ANCAPs like myself, but there's also the minarchists who believe in the minimal state that focuses simply on criminal justice and protecting property rights. And so for that sense, I will actually advocate for liberty in a broad sense to actually include that. But then, why do I advocate for anarcho-capitalism? It's because I believe it's the most logically consistent system. That it doesn't have any inherent contradictions in it. It doesn't create, this system where magistrates are having to violate property rights in the name of upholding property rights. But let's actually get to this section of Romans 13. Let's actually get to the text, because we're really getting to the heart of that particular debate that I had recently, which is over the question of whether taxation is theft. I'm sure you've heard that hashtag or seen that hashtag online. It's very popular. Everybody talks about it. Taxation is theft. Well, the question before us is it true? Is taxation theft? So let's look at what Romans 13, 6 and 7 says. It says, "For because of this you also pay taxes. For the authorities are ministers of God, attending to this very thing. Pay to all what is owed them, taxes to whom taxes are owed, revenue to whom revenue is owed, respect to whom respect is owed, honor to whom honor is owed." Okay, so it says, because of this, you also pay taxes. Because of what? Because the authorities are ministers of God, attending to this very thing. What very thing? Well, back up a couple verses. He is the servant of God, an avenger who carries out God's wrath on the wrongdoer. Then it says, pay to all what is owed them, taxes to whom taxes are owed, and so on. Right. So my interpretation here, taking the whole passage as a whole, is that here's the command. Pay for the services you use. Use this service. Since under the state, we really aren't given an option of whether to subscribe to the service or not, we're instructed to consider our required taxation, sort of instructed to consider that to be a subscription to the service of the sword. and our duty to submit is because we want to see justice done. We want to see the magistrate upholding the sword in the right way. And so, because this is the option that we're given, we're going to subscribe to that. We're going to support his fulfillment of that role. It is for the purpose of fulfilling that role. That's why. So, the argument that my friend made is that it says, pay all what is owed to them, taxes to whom taxes are owed. So his point is, it says that, taxes are owed, right? It wouldn't say that taxes are owed if they're never owed. His logic goes on, things that are owed aren't theft, and therefore these taxes that are legitimately owed are not theft. Okay. I see the strength of this argument. It's one that I used to make myself. I was a minarchist, 5 years ago, I guess. That's been a while. I used to have trouble with this one, honestly. I used to appeal to this and the rest of the chapter, and would make the argument that taxation is valid for the purpose of funding criminal justice, and only for the purpose of funding criminal justice. That's my friend's position, because they serve us by bearing the sword, so we owe it to them to pay them. I'm not unsympathetic to that view. I don't think it's stupid. I don't think it's evil or anything like that. If that's your interpretation, and I can't convince you otherwise, great. That's fine. Honestly, I'll debate on it. I'll make my case, but I don't think you're stupid or evil or heretical or anything like that. I'm not going to call you an evil statist. Again, I broad tent here. I am all for liberty-minded folks, even if they're minarchists. Even if they don't believe that an ANCAP society would be more just or more effective. Fine. As long as your understanding of what the role of government is constrained to what God defines it here to be, fine. Again, God, the Bible doesn't take a dogmatic position on what form of government. I have a strong preference, but it's just a preference. It's a logical deduction. I'm not going to look down on people who disagree with me on that. But I am going to make my case, since I'm here to analyze these things, and this is my show. I'm going to point out that I still think there's a problem with that position. Because it actually begs the question of what taxes are actually owed, doesn't it? There's an inherent problem with the way the state operates. A state, by definition, is a territorial monopoly on the service of justice. They claim that they have the right to rule everybody in a geographic area. And the issue here is that they use their sword to force people to come under their authority. Now imagine, if you have people living in a certain area, and they're just, there. Let's say that, let's imagine a completely alternative scenario, right? Where, I don't know, history unfolds completely differently than it does. And so we're living here, and, I live in Ohio. But Ohio has been just kind of organically grown up as an independent society. We never applied. Imagine, Northwest Territories or whatever. Ohio never applied for statehood. Let's imagine Ohio never applied for statehood. We've just sort of been our own thing. And then the government, the United States federal government, decides, well, we want to annex Ohio. Like, come over with their military and annex Ohio. And then say, okay, now you guys have to pay taxes to the federal government. Would that be legitimate? Well, I say no. Because it starts with violent subjugation. The state basically operates that way. They claim the right to dictate to everybody in a region, to say, you must submit to our use of the sword. And in doing that, they're not so much providing justice as they are actually providing injustice. They're violently subjugating people. Or nowadays, they don't necessarily so much use violence anymore, especially since everybody's sort of under the government, but they certainly use like an implied threat, right? And And most importantly, they use deception. And they spend 12 years indoctrinating this view of the government as this inherently good and necessary institution. Now, I'm not going to say government is a bad thing, but government as defined by the just use of the sword is a good thing. But that doesn't necessarily have to be the state, but the state promotes this idea that it has to be them. And so, we are commanded to submit to the state, right? But again, there's not permission here for the magistrate to conquer those and make them submit. The verb here in verse 1, be subject to. It's reflexive. It is an action taken by the one being subjected. We are to subject ourselves to them. There's not a clear exegetical permission for the state to go subjugate people and make them subscribe to their service. There isn't. So let's ask this question. If the state is legitimate, and it's wrong to have people in different areas having different authorities over them, right? I mean, that's what we have to imply if we have to say the state is good. Then we have to say the alternative is bad, right? I'm advocating and saying, people in different areas can have different authorities over them, right? It must therefore be bad and wrong and immoral for there to be one government over the United States and another over Canada. Should we not be advocating for a government of North America? And why should there be one government over North America and another government over Europe? Shouldn't we have one government around the whole world? So we don't question these things when we zoom out, right? And in a sense, all Hoppe's view is saying, the people in, Podunk, Alabama should have their government. Why does Washington, D.C. have authorization to go make the people in Podunk, Georgia, or Alabama, whatever I said? Well, why does the Washington, D.C. have permission and authority to go force them to be subject to them? Again, given the fact that things are the way they are, and we are commanded to submit, we submit to that. We go along with that, right? Because we're not here to be revolutionaries. We're not here to overthrow them. But that's category 1. Category 2 is that's not legitimate. It's not legitimate to require people to be subjected. It's not at all. The state exists to punish people who hurt victims. Not the state, the government, magistrate, right? And the state can definitely fulfill that service, but it doesn't have to be the state. And the state does it by taking a step back, right? Their first act is to violate property rights by taking taxes before they consider whether they actually are legitimately owed. By contrast, in an ANCAP society, the state, or the government, taxes would only be collected from those who actually use the services, like a fee-for-service model. Or those who would, voluntarily contract and have, a protection insurance policy ahead of time, right? To say, you'll be the police force, I'll call if I need you, come and protect me or whatever. And if I call you, you'll come and, stop the guy who's going to shoot me or whatever. Right? So, in that way, then, the taxes that are owed in the same way that, any other obligation comes to be owed, at least in the human civil category. The only one exception to that method of coming to owe something that we can clearly exegete from Scripture, and that's when your criminal actions cause harm to others. In that case, you owe them restitution. It's not clearly exegeted from Scripture here that the state's demand that you must submit to them creates a true obligation, in your sense, to actually owe them taxes. Now, they'll claim that, and so again, because we live at peace, because we are called to submit and not to directly resist, because we are called to view ourselves as being subscribing to the service, and even though, on a market, we would subscribe to one, this is our only option, so I guess this is the one we have to subscribe to. All those layers of thinking, right? From category 1. In category 2, demanding that you pay taxes to this authority and saying, I'm the king of the hill, everybody must pay taxes to me. Why? Because you won your war to take control of the region? Right? That's how any king comes to be in power, in a human sense. He comes to be in power by winning wars. And God indeed sovereignly ordains these things and sets up the kings and sets up kingdoms and all that stuff. And he is the one who sovereignly ordains where we're going to live and all this stuff. So that's true, but that does not confer upon them moral righteousness in doing it. And so I'm sort of belaboring this point, but it's an important line of thinking here. The state, in a state, taxes only come to be quote unquote owned because of the king's edict. He demands that they pay it, whether you've used the service or not, whether you're a criminal and you owe somebody restitution or not. So that's a performative contradiction. Performative contradiction because in doing so, like I said, they first have to violate and seize property rights. Their job is to protect people from that kind of seizure, and in order to protect them, they have to do it to them. So people who would maybe not otherwise have been stolen from now are being stolen from in the name of protecting them from being stolen from. Even on the first category, that's valid and actually commanded that we look at taxes as a subscription to the magistrate and pay them. In the second category, we have to say the state is inherently evil in that regard when they do that. So my analysis is that in a state, taxation is theft. Even taxation for the purpose of funding criminal justice is theft. Because it's done first by subjugation. In my view, the state, as an institution, has inherent flaws in this. They have to commit theft in order to provide the service. My friend would say, well, it's not actually theft because God authorizes it here. I don't see that exegetically. I don't. In my view, you have to kind of read that in if you're going to try to get that out of this text. He will seem to imply that it's logically necessary, but that sort of begs the question of whether a state is legitimate or a state is necessary. If the state is the only way to organize such a thing, then maybe that's valid. Maybe. But the state is not the only way to organize it. The state is not the only way that it can be organized. It can be organized through a market or through covenant communities. So that implication, that inference, is not valid. And there are other objections he'll raise to back up reading this idea in here. But ultimately, I think it has to be read in. I don't think it comes from the text. It's a presupposition that it must be valid because God has given the authority to be the government to the government, and therefore, here's the presupposition: being the government means that you subjugate the people in your territory, which assumes that the definition of government necessarily involves territorial monopoly. I reject that. I think the definition of government involves doing the service described here, as I've backed up from other places in Scripture. My broader view of the idea of what's actually going on here. He's a servant. He's not an overlord. So it's a nuanced debate that we'll get into some of the objections more later. But for now, I think we can just leave that there. So as a voter then, as an ANCAP voter, we sort of find ourselves in a duplicitous situation here, right? What do we do? We especially, we Reformed Libertarians, we've actually kind of felt this pinch for a while. We've ever since 2012, right? Things were great in 2008 and 2012 when we had Ron Paul, woohoo, right? after 2012, he retired. We're sort of in this dilemma, right? Do we push for these ideals of being a full ANCAP, or do we tolerate people who fall short of that mark and rally behind somebody who's more of a minarchist, like an Austin Peterson or a Rand Paul or something like that, right? And where's, how much compromise can we have without really compromising our principles and everything? So I think there's sort of a similar proper way of thinking about that here, right? I think, in my view, it is the 100% correct purist position here is that a market government is better because it doesn't have the same kind of self-contradictions of the state, right? But given that we have a state, there's not really anything we can do about that, right? And in fact, like I said, we're not called to change that. We're not called to try to overthrow that. Unless maybe we can through the political process, but, who knows if that's even possible, right? So what does that leave us then? Well, I would agree that it's valid to sort of take this view that Paul gives us. I think that's, in fact, what we're commanded here. Even though the state has monopolized this service, and even though they engage in violent and deceptive subjugation of people, we should still sort of think of them in the same way that we would think, or treat them, hold them to the same sort of standard that we would like a non-monopoly provider, right? We should still expect them to uphold justice and advocate that they do that their justice would be geared towards protecting property rights. And since they're the state and they're not going away, we can fund them through taxation as a necessary evil. And I insist that we must view it as a necessary evil. A necessary evil, but still an evil, right? And that's the way I view it. I say this is a necessary evil. I hold and say, it would be better to have a market to where none of this is funded through taxation. And I really believe, as a society in a free market, justice will be provided. And so the state has monopolized it, but I think, this is something that would exist on a free market. And so I'll support it. I'll subscribe to it. I would subscribe to it on a free market. I'm going to subscribe to this through the state. I think that's the way Paul wants us to think about it. Say, this is a service that is good and necessary. Use this service. Subscribe to the service. Great. Right? Category 1, this really doesn't matter that it's a state, right? Category 2, though, if we can't really get rid of the state, so let's try to advocate, though, that they be as streamlined and minarchist as possible. And I think that, advocating for that sort of minarchy, viewing taxation for the purpose of criminal justice and national defense as an extension of criminal justice, right? Not like going over and starting wars in Iran, but, there's a threat to property from, the thug down the street, or there's a threat to property from a guy flying a plane over from Russia, right? Still, same kind of idea, right? Viewing them this way, we can sort of still advocate that they operate in ways that are just. Right, and we don't have to be a full purist. If there are ways that we can try to move towards anarcho-capitalism, I think that would be great. Can we really get there? Probably not. Well, I mean, I in general, I'm pessimistic about our prospects for actually getting to a minarchy anyway. Right, but anyway, I still would prefer my minarchists to be like Ron Paul, to where they have more of an anarchist philosophy, that they are compromising slightly for the purpose of being an agent for change in the state that exists, right? Rather than a guy like Austin Peterson, who completely throws away the non-aggression principle and uses some consequentialist reasoning to justify, as he says, small harms for the sake of large goods or whatever. I really don't like that. Although I do kind of think that Austin Peterson might not be a bad guy to rally around. I don't know where I stand on him, really. His interview on Jeff Durbin's Next Week Tonight was actually pretty good, and I just don't know with him. I didn't like him in 2016, but he really he took it to Gary Johnson, and he really exposed Gary Johnson for the fraud that he is, and I actually really appreciate that. I don't think he would have won anyway. Obviously, he wouldn't have won the presidency. Could he have won the nomination? Well, obviously he didn't. Although he would have been better than Gary Johnson, sticking his tongue out. What's Aleppo? And all that. So I don't know. So given that the state has monopolized the service, it's valid to allow taxation that is solely directed towards the purpose of fulfilling the role of magistrate. I still think it's theft. I still think it's theft in a state. But it's a necessary evil, right? It's a weird situation we find ourselves in. And I do want to actually, if there's a concern that was raised to me by this friend, and I want to sort of address this because his concern is, when we go out there and we say taxation is theft, and we start to make these arguments to say, well, look, the state should not be stealing from people in order to fund their operations, right? And that's my position, right? The state shouldn't be stealing from people to fund their operations, right? He says, well, what about somebody who works in government? What about a Christian police officer who works in government, right? Are we saying that they're living in sin for taking a salary from the state that is taken by force from people through taxes? And I'm going to say no to that. I really am honestly going to say no to that. Because again, like I said, in a market, police would exist. Justice is a need of society. And the market would provide it. So this job would exist. And God says this job is good. And God commands us to subscribe to this job. It's not the fault of the police officer that their employer has monopolized their industry. It's not. It's not their concern either. Especially, and I'm speaking mostly of Christians. And I know Christians who are solid believers who are police officers. And if any of you are listening to this and hear me talking about these things, I would be very surprised to hear that. Welcome. But if you happen to be listening to this and hear me talking about these things, hear me very clearly. I very much believe and insist that you guys are good cops. And I insist that there are good cops out there. People who understand justice, who understand what the police are supposed to be about and doing, and are really out there trying their best to fulfill this role of the magistrate here in Romans 13. And by all means, is this ever tough for them? Because given the way that our state has made unjust laws, and the system is rigged, and all of the flaws in the system, and by all means, I respect and honor you. Because this is necessary, and in fact, in many ways, it's actually more necessary for us to have good cops in this industry because of the way it's corrupt. If we withdraw from this, and we don't try to be agents for change, and we don't try to be the good cops in the system, oh man, what's going to happen, right? I mean, I already mentioned Jeff Durbin next week. If you watched his most recent episode where he talks about art, he says, originally Christians were involved in film, and then when they withdrew from film, the whole industry just went sideways, right? It's the same thing would happen with police, right? If we don't have Christians in these roles, even especially in the state, I mean, we don't have the salt and light there, and what happened then, right? So I absolutely commend Christian cops. I would not want to be in their position of having to daily live with this conflict of I have to do my job and I have to keep my job, and that means I have to walk this line between all these unjust laws I have to enforce, giving people speeding tickets, etc. But I'm here to try to uphold true justice and fulfill this role. And I don't want to add more conflict to your conscience. By all means. Your job is good and necessary and important, and keep doing it. And I voluntarily subscribe to you, even if it's through the taxation of the government. And I would voluntarily subscribe to you, even if it was on a free market. It's not the funding of your role. It's not the funding of your job that is the problem. That's not the part that's theft. The part that's theft is the way that the state mandates it. And the way that the state punishes people who, even though they've never used the service, and even though they've never done anything criminal, but because the state says you must subscribe to this particular service, we are going to subjugate you. And I insist that in the absence of doing that, a market would arise in which people would be able to subscribe and would be allowed to subscribe, and we would have a better system, I believe. And so that's getting a little more into the pragmatic side of things, but a little bit of pragmatic economic analysis, wouldn't go amiss at some point to think about what would happen in such a system, such a society. Maybe someday I'll get into it. But I want to be very clear on this, right? Taxation is a necessary evil in a state. I insist that it's evil. I insist that it's theft. But I see that it's necessary. And I see that we are commanded to pay it here from Paul. And so don't rebel against that. Don't fight against that. In fact, view it as a good thing. View it as a service to your neighbor. View it as love for your neighbor, to provide for them, even though it is, one way to look at it validly, is that it is a bit of a socialization. It's a socialism a little bit for this industry. In fact, it is, really. I mean, socialism is defined as public ownership of the means of production. This is public ownership of the means of production of justice, right? So it's socialism. You're paying to fund justice on the behalf of other people who may or may not be able to pay for it, right? This is a bit of wealth redistribution in that way, right? And so, but you are loving your neighbor in doing this. And so, because we're not called to overthrow government, and because maybe it would be a little chaotic for us to just disband the state at first, who knows? But mainly because we're not called to overthrow. We are called to submit. We are called not to resist. We are called to subscribe and to be ordered under. Let's do it. Okay? But from category 2, let's remember taxation is theft in a state. And so it's a necessary evil. And it should be restrained at maximum to only funding the provision of justice. And it would be better if we could find a way to do it without mandating it, which is why I prefer anarcho-capitalism. Anyway, I've sort of been a little rambly here at the end. I hope I've been clear on this. I hope I laid out my case. I'm sure there's more objections that will probably come pouring in. There are more objections I can get to from this debate from my friend, things that I should probably mention and talk about. This is really good. I thank you for tuning in, very much so. Please like and comment and subscribe. Please share with your friends. Please give me any comments and feedback that you have. I've received a couple comments already. Thank you very much for your feedback. There's been a couple things I might actually talk about. I don't know. We'll see. Very much interested in your thoughts on this and everything. I'm going to continue on. I probably might come back to dealing with objections soon. If not, I might go back to the political compass test. I don't know. We'll see. I'm not sure exactly what I'm going to do next, but hopefully we can carry this on. If you have topics that you want me to cover, by all means, let me know, and I will do my best to do them justice. I hope that this has been good and helpful as we think through these things and we think through the logic. So thank you for your time.